Some art styles just do seem to be more commercially viable than others. But also, often industries get stale. Everything becomes very much the same, and you need the avant-garde to come through and bust down doors and create something new and fresh. As an aspiring artist, though, it can be tricky to know where you actually fit, because it's very challenging to be cutting against the grain of what works. It's often a lot safer in the beginning of our careers to kind of fit in, to make our art fit in. That's what's going to make us more commercially viable. But also, I think a lot of us want to create new things, to have unique styles. And I think there's just a constant, continual tension here. What I want to do in this video is a study session. Just look at a bunch of different artists who I think are successful, a lot of different books and art books and comics, and see if we can just sort of look at and study this idea of balancing extreme sort of visual appeal and art styles that are kind of safe and kind of just tend to work versus things that can be a little bit more avant-garde, things that can be a little bit unsafe. As usual for a Drawing Codex video that's going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just you and me. We're going to look at a whole bunch of art books and talk about art theory and style and a bunch of these other kind of amorphous philosophical topics. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you will join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about illustration or picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. This charts my journey going from someone who really wasn't that good at drawing or art to becoming a professional artist, being published. I discuss topics such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to think about composition, creating thumbnails for your scenes, as well as a few ideas surrounding how to think about getting professional work. It's free and the link will be in the description, so if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. So I guess there's always a tension for every artist at every point in your career, essentially, between sticking with the crowd and doing what is kind of sensible and commercially viable and, you know, to sort of raise in status and to climb ladders and become sort of better known for doing a particular thing. And we could kind of contrast that attitude with the more sort of avant-garde attitude, people being sort of an artist, let's say, where, you know, someone really is having a much stronger point of view and often they are trying to counteract a lot of what is sort of common wisdom, stuff that sort of would sell or that is commercially viable or is a little bit more safe. And often, again, doing that can be very risky, especially if they are on this sort of mission to create stuff that, you know, is just something from their imagination, something that's very personal to them. You know, often they create really interesting things, but there isn't a market for it, right? And it is really hard and it doesn't go that well. But we often look back on those efforts very fondly, and often artists are very much inspired by these points in time where, you know, people really did sort of break through and manage to kind of really sort of move the needle and do something different. Anyway, I find this just a fascinating idea, and I thought it would be good to look at some artists that I think exemplify this, and also how a lot of these ideas filter down into popular culture and we can become sort of enmeshed and stuck in them. So anyway, this is a little bit of a psychedelic sort of interesting sort of concept here about the difference between commercial viability of styles and sort of avant-garde, real sort of heavy point of view styles. And again, how I think this is one of those sort of cycles that exists. And, you know, you got to know where you want to be in that cycle, right? Because it's easy to get either kind of stuck in bland land or just get sort of crunched up by the machine if you try and step out of line. So, yes, no surprise, we are going to be looking at Jean Giraud / Moebius again on the Drawing Codex channel. No surprise if you've been if you've been hanging out for a while. You know I'm a big Moebius fan, but I really don't know any other artist who embodies this idea, because Jean Giraud literally took on the alter ego Moebius and changed a lot of his sort of visual style and really sort of helped kickstart the sort of metal hurlant, sort of more sort of avant-garde French books. And these really changed a lot of popular culture, of design language of the world, and let people know a lot of what was possible with sort of comics. And they influenced a lot of artists. And I think it was very sort of influential overall. Before the artist became, again, the late Jean Giraud or Moebius became, the alter ego Moebius, where he's sort of very known for this type of psychedelic, like high fantasy, real sort of clean line style work that typifies what a lot of people understand about the French sort of comic book style. He actually, spent a lot of his career early on drawing like a Western comic and probably a bunch of other sort of projects. With Charlier, they created Blueberry, which is just a classic American Old West kind of story, right? With sort of cowboys and Indians and all that kind of stuff. And he was actually really, really good at it, right? Was amazingly talented and skillful and had a massive amount of craft when it came to creating and drawing horses. Like, horses are some of the hardest things to draw, right? If we kind of zoom up a little bit, you can kind of see some of this work, right? Just like amazing craft, creating these scenes, classic Franco-Belgian sort of art style. And you can already see like the expressiveness of the lines, the fluidity of it, the structure. But it is a lot of this structure that often underpins some of what comes later and really sort of anchors a lot of that fantasy. And I think this is something that's really important to pay attention to, is that I think often having an understanding of commercial viability, right, and what the norm is, it is something that may actually be really useful if you are trying to sort of challenge it to some degree. But again, you can sort of see the craft and the skill and the ability to create consistent characters and have an interesting style. But, this is very much grounded in historical fiction, right? This is an Old West story where you've got to draw the revolvers and the environments and the costumes and horses again and all these kind of different things, right? This probably does not age well in terms of sort of politics and stuff like that. But again, from an artistic point of view, I think it's really, really good. And you can sort of see that sort of change. Go back to over the top shot. Yeah, you can really sort of see often like a bit of the style that, Moebius is known for certainly came through in some of these early Blueberry stories. But again, mostly what I notice is the sort of commitment to craft and a lot of the traditional paradigms of sort of French comics and really sort of building a solid base of sequential art. But yeah, again, these are just really, really good. And well worth sort of checking out. Again, if you're just interested in sequential art, looking at the sort of Blueberry stories is very, very interesting. You learn a lot about how to create, very sort of classic, amazing sort of French comics. And you can see a lot of the, I guess, abstraction that sort of followed with Moebius. And very, very well worth sort of studying this if you're interested in sort of French comics. Or again, what came next, which was where, Jean Giraud as Moebius created a completely sort of different version of himself and got a little bit more. Again, if I sort of skip over anything, that there are probably some not safe for work pages in here. So if I this is a weird edit, don't worry, it's just because I hit something and kind of cut it out. But yeah, you can really kind of see that the artist was able to kind of take a lot of those skills and really kind of make them into something unique and interesting. And again, I think the idea of building an alter ego is actually maybe something that is worth considering if you are wanting to, take maybe an existing career and sort of morph it a little bit, or feel free to kind of play around and do something completely different. But yeah, it's interesting how Jean Giraud not only sort of changed his style, but also developed, much more sort of expressive storytelling and was able to sort of create these really sort of interesting worlds that kind of just weren't possible sort of before that. And it really sort of, again, told people a lot about what was possible with sort of comics. And it created a lot of, what we sort of now would look at as the sort of heavy metal, or in France, obviously heavy metal was metal Hurlant. And, with other artists, he sort of created that entire sort of, much more visceral type of story, the sort of heavy metal science fiction stories. You've got, again, Lone Sloan by Druillet. And I think this, again, is a great example of where you can get this kind of really crazy, amazing, psychedelic sort of storytelling that I'm imagining. Again, let me know like how this, if you were around when this kind of turned over. I don't know how many people listening would actually be in that sort of group, but yeah, I mean, this would have been something that was, sort of new and fresh, right? The ideas that were in Metal Hurlant, the sort of degree to which it was sort of changing what would be acceptable. And again, a lot of these stories were probably a little bit confronting compared to sort of what had come before. And I know there were quite a few serious censorship issues in France in terms of what was or was not possible in bande dessinée at the time. And again, that sort of it took quite a while to actually really change. But yeah, again, you can kind of see that, again, with other artists, like Jean Giraud became Moebius and again, changed the entire paradigm for what was sort of possible with comics. And you just get this kind of crazy, crazy stuff. Like, how crazy is Druillet? How good is Druillet? I just remember being super inspired by just kind of the look of this early on. Just the colors, the intensity, just like such cool sort of perspective shots. And again, you just really get this kind of visceral feeling for like, whoa, like this is what science fiction should be. And again, you can kind of imagine that, maybe more previous to this, science fiction was a little bit more sanitized, right? It's kind of like lost in space. It's all very sort of sterile. And, you really get some of this sort of crazy stuff that I think of that era, a lot of people were really trying to sort of imagine. You have things like sort of Dune. Again, these are not in the same sort of decade even, potentially, but really sort of changing and reconsidering what science fiction might be and what other worlds might be like, or what other realities, if you had completely different technology, right? Like what would happen. And I think also like the interesting thing is if you sort of look at how Jodorowsky and Moebius kind of created the Incal. Here we go. I mean, the interesting thing is like that, although this is kind of psychedelic science fiction, and you may kind of just like look at a lot of the stuff that's kind of happening here, a lot of it is actually doing quite a good job of sort of commenting on a lot of the politics, right? Because Jodorowsky was Chilean, right? And he was kind of commenting, I think, I'm assuming, on a lot of the extreme sort of political unrest that was there. And if you actually kind of read a lot of these stories, they were really talking about these ideas of sort of totalitarianism and, how, you have these kind of crazy techno-religious, these kind of absurd, theatrical, over-the-top kind of things. But again, if you kind of read this, you really do get like such a strong point of view that was very sort of rebellious and talking about, sort of like freeing the, human creativity. And there's a lot of sort of Freudian sort of psychological, psychoactive sort of brutality here. But a lot of it is kind of anchored in, again, sort of looking at and exploring these ideas of totalitarian regimes and, how, you just have these kind of crazy power mad people and, everyone just gets destroyed and entire races get sort of wiped out. And, history is just this kind of series of upheavals. And, there is actually like a lot of kind of art here, right? It often seems like it is just kind of craziness and, that's just people from the 70s who took a bit too much acid. But it's interesting to note that, again, there is a lot of dissent here and there is a lot of truth. And I think reading that and understanding and sort of getting like a lot of these things, like as a kid, like reading this stuff, like this will really change how you view sort of like war and politics and political regimes and a lot of this kind of stuff. And again, I think that's actually something that we don't have a lot of that right now. I think like if you look at sort of today's entertainment climate, right, it is pretty tepid, right? It is very tame in terms of new ideas and again, people sort of challenging a lot of these concepts of war and political regimes that are, unkind to people, right? But yeah, I think you saw through Jean Giraud and an artist like Druillet really sort of change the narrative, right, around sort of both what is possible with comics. And I think the interesting thing is that often comics actually is frequently at the forefront, or at least in the past has been at a lot of these kind of pivotal changes, right? Because it's something where you get a visual ability to kind of represent the world and tell a story, but the budget you need for it is so much less than any other medium that you really become able to kind of tell stories and say things and kind of set the tone in a way that, is just not possible when you have higher budgets of film and, video games and those kind of things that, again, just are much more rife with sort of editorial control from the people who control the purse strings. In keeping with the theme of comics and the way that they often are linked to societal change and what is sort of considered, I guess, sort of politically correct or sort of possible, there's been a lot of sort of censorship of comics over the years, like across the world, really. It's always quite interesting to look into the history of that stuff. But, you had artists like sort of Jack Kirby here, who we've got in, this sort of very old beaten up sort of story, right? Really sort of creating a lot of the Marvel universe, not just in terms of making and designing a lot of the characters, but also in defining a lot of the style of what was really considered to be sort of comic book. And you can sort of imagine how like important comic books would have been to explore a lot of these ideas. There was really no competing with a comic book for its ability to create a lot of these worlds. Going back to looking at a lot of the art that you would have by someone like Druillet, I mean, now it kind of maybe seems like, oh, okay, you could probably get some visual effects to kind of create some of this stuff, but there's just no way any sort of movie is going to be able to do this, right? It is going to be able to create this level of sort of weirdness, right? Like the budgets, the way that it sort of changes from one sort of world to another, to one story to another. And just the degree of character designs, the weird sort of monsters and creatures. Like even today in video games, things are very much limited by technology of what you can animate, how you can rig things, like what is and is not possible technologically, and what looks good with sort of modern game engines. And I think, again, comics still has a good sort of role to play there. But yeah, you sort of, it's hard to imagine what something like this would have meant to people who had no way of kind of watching something like, the latest kind of Dune movies, right? That actually have a lot of, I guess, this sort of level of weirdness and science fiction actually kind of illustrated and made real, right? You can actually sort of see a lot of these kind of ships in play. And, this idea, I think, is something that's worth considering, right? And the way that someone like Jack Kirby would have created much of that dynamism, right? And again, a lot of other artists kind of helped, but I think it often was just sort of Jack Kirby really putting a stake in the ground and kind of saying like, hey, we're just going to go crazy here. And there's just so many of these kind of just weird ideas, right? You got like ships flying around and these three-headed monsters and, people really using their powers in super inventive ways. Having all these like rock monsters fight each other, right? Like this is really sort of extreme, right? And even though the art is quite simple, it's super effective, right? It really, really works quite well. And yeah, you can see not just that, but like at the end of this extremely broken book, right? Just to the degree to where you see a lot of the historical mythology sort of being combined with sort of Marvel styles, and just the boldness and the extreme nature of it, right? This weird rainbow road and just the way he's kind of creating the Asgardian sort of look, right? It's just crazy how much this was now, comics were now about sort of adventure, right? And sort of anything goes. And you really see that, as comics sort of progress, right? Like anything became possible, right? And it did open up a lot of sort of creativity. Now, before that, you obviously had a lot of stuff like this, right? Sort of Hal Foster, right? And they go to actually sort of great pains to kind of point out how, in this book, here we go, that a lot of artists were actually pretty inspired by Hal Foster. They sort of point out how Frank Frazetta's signature actually looks pretty similar to Hal Foster's signature, and how people were kind of often really, they'd obviously sort of seen the stories that he created for Prince Valiant, right, in the Sunday sort of strips, and people were kind of, he was in everyone's head, basically. They sort of talk about how it's not just that, right, but often people were just sort of swiping panels, right, even, sort of Alex Raymond here, right, sort of swiping this sort of idea for a panel, and, they're talking quite rightly about how, a lot of people, didn't quite have the technical capability that he had, right, even sort of after, the perspective is not quite as advanced, it really was sort of this pinnacle of sort of artistry and craft. And, if you look at a lot of the Prince Valiant illustrations, right, these were done quite big. They are, like, the anatomy is always quite good, like historically accurate. Quite similar to a lot of the way that, French bande dessinée will be, sort of very historically accurate, really embodying a particular place and time. Yeah. But again, they're a little bit tame, right? It's a little bit sort of reserved, right? And it's very of its time. And I think that's where you see, despite that the Marvel Comics way became, it went from being this sort of avant-garde thing that was new to being something that was, now kind of standard. And it's interesting, if you kind of read things that sort of John Buscema said, who John Buscema is famously the person who drew How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And he kind of says that I think he took a period of illustrating romance novels and then sort of came back to Marvel at some point. And, just in the quick time that he kind of left and came back, everything had become about this kind of dynamic Jack Kirby way of sort of illustrating everything, right? Really getting a lot of these sort of dynamic poses down. And, John Buscema sort of talks about, I think from memory, that, he just sort of took that on and was like, okay, yep, I got it. This is what we're doing now. Lots of poses like this, right? Lots of sort of dynamic sketching, lots of opposing the torso so that you get this kind of dynamic feel. And this really became what you would sort of now view as being sort of very comic booky, right? It's literally like a pastiche of itself, right? It's like a stereotype. So again, it's always interesting to see how these things kind of ebb and flow. And obviously, people started to really sort of mess with this in the 90s, right? And create a lot of sort of really interesting comics, right? The cycle always continues. And you can see the same thing happening with Frank Frazetta's own style. You obviously had people like Hal Foster or people like J. Allen St. John who very much influenced Frazetta. And this is often the thing that I think is important to pay attention to is, it's not always about craft, right? Like both artists have a very sort of strong grasp of reality, of good illustration, of anatomy, of composition, of all the things that you would kind of want to have, right? As an artist. And, a lot of the illustrations that St. John created were, very good. But, there's often just not that kind of visceral thing that you see with, artists like Kirby, artists like Frank Frazetta, who really sort of took it to the next level. And, similar to how Druillet kind of showed what these kind of crazy science fiction stories could be like, Frank Frazetta really kind of turned a lot of this stuff up and sort of showed how visceral some of these scenarios could be, right? A lot of this is really a matter of, being a little bit reserved, right? Again, it's from an illustrative point of view, from a craft standpoint, it's really good. But from a what the artist is saying and what their voice is, and how that sort of influences the world and what other people think about it. It really sort of took a Frank Frazetta to come along and kind of say, hey, we're going to make things a little bit more sort of extreme. And if you read the book and a lot of the interviews with Frazetta, he sort of talks about how people kind of wanted him to just do J. Allen St. John, right? And just sort of capitulate, right, to what was that sort of formal, like, unified style. And he kind of pushed back on that and wanted to do something different. And I think that was sort of an interesting sort of point in time, right, where you really sort of saw that change. And a lot of people were very influenced by the visceral nature of Frazetta's art. Other painters, other comic book artists, other people who were, now looking at this and saying like, oh, wow, I didn't know we could do that now. And once they're sort of able to sort of push things to that level, you sort of get a whole nother possibility. And this influenced, writers, again, directors, people creating all sorts of things, just the extreme sort of nature of it. And I think made a lot of that violence a little bit more real, right? A little bit less fantastical. And again, I think that's probably a good thing. Now, it's also possible, as I've been hinting at, that often you see a lot of these ideas evolve in a particular industry, like comics or something, where you can push these boundaries. You can have a real single voice of an author having something to say, with assistance in the case of Akira and Katsuhiro Otomo. But, how many people have been inspired and influenced across the world by Akira, both the manga and the sort of animation that it inspired. And it's interesting to say, as I've often said, how Otomo was influenced by Jean Giraud, right? And Moebius more specifically, and that particular line style. But yeah, like a lot of this was, again, people being introduced to what was possible with Japanese manga, right? And really sort of pushing the limits for detail and this kind of crazy psychedelic science fiction story. And again, I don't really know how sort of innovative Akira was at the time. That would probably be something that's good to kind of look into. I know it was something that was kind of really special. But yeah, this has gone on to really sort of influence how, a lot of artists kind of create their work. And a lot of people really interested in science fiction and the particular look that especially you got with the animation that was, directly created by Otomo, right? And it's always interesting to see these little points in time where you really get an interesting aesthetic, an interesting point of view, something really sort of different sort of comes out, and it just kind of changes everything, right? Changes sort of what is possible. Not always, again, just in terms of like the medium, but it also bleeds into other mediums, right? And this is where often you don't really see the effects of these things until much later on. It's also worth noting how frequently we do get stuck in ruts with things like sort of design and accepted versions of what the future will look like, right? So even though a lot of the sort of needles were pushed forward, no one really, I think, ever really got over Geiger's Alien from Ridley Scott's Alien film. And it's interesting to see how a lot of comic book artists and a lot of comic book style art actually directly played a role in creating a movie like Alien, which I think has influenced a lot of what people, think science fiction is like, right? It really has defined how we sort of view the future. But yeah, as I said, like I just don't think people really have ever gotten over the distinct vision for sort of Geiger's Alien, right? And this is a book with a lot of sort of, behind the scenes. It is obviously not necessarily an art book. But yeah, I find like the making of Alien to be something that's kind of totally fascinating because again, I think, if you're not sort of aware of a lot of the story behind that, Jodorowsky, who created the Incal with Jean Giraud, famously had a failed attempt at making Dune, Frank Herbert's sort of series of novels that has recently been successfully, I think, translated into some decent films. Jodorowsky failed to sort of do that, and a lot of the artists and people involved in that actually sort of made their way into, what became Alien in some interesting ways. But yeah, like if you kind of look at, this sort of first version of the Alien, like, again, I think it would not have been the same if we didn't have Geiger, right? And that sort of craziness to sort of really inspire people. And it's also interesting how often, like it takes people who are actually kind of artists and are able to kind of think through and control a lot of this vision to actually make it happen, right? You had a huge variety of different highly skilled sort of artists working on the film, including like Ron Cobb, Chris Foss, designing sort of spaceships and production design, but also Ridley Scott actually is, most people sort of know this, but again, you often don't see the boards. He was an accomplished artist and he storyboarded a lot of the original sort of Alien film. And my understanding is those are sort of his storyboards. But yeah, you can really see how, like, having a distinct point of view and having people who understand how to really sort of turn that into something can really upend, right, a lot of the world, right? In the same way that you had Druillet or Moebius, Jean Giraud really sort of changing and modifying what is kind of possible with sort of comics, you started to see, I think, a lot of that start to make its way into film. And that, I think, has really sort of set in stone what a lot of people are still sort of chasing, right? A lot of Alien designs still look like Geiger Alien designs, right? We sort of haven't really recovered from that. And the, a lot of, what people imagine being in the future is like, right, is very much sort of defined by these kind of seminal films. Classically, Jean Giraud was actually employed to create some of the sort of costume designs. I don't know how many of them actually sort of made it in there, but again, those sort of cricket leg protector things did seem to have their roots in a lot of his design, and they did actually make it into the final sort of film. So yeah, always interesting to see how these kind of things are made. And although sort of Alien is obviously like a really sort of good film, and I don't want to necessarily be prescriptive in saying like, oh, this is why it succeeded, or whatever. I think that having people who were able to kind of move it to the next stage and really create something super interesting and commit to that vision, right, I think is very sort of challenging, right? And again, it's interesting to see how we haven't quite sort of changed our tune in terms of sort of what science fiction is since then in many, many ways, right? You get these films that really kind of shake things up. And things are never quite the same after that, right? We never quite go back to the old sort of Lost in Space 60s style of science fiction. And I think you can learn a lot just about sort of how things are made by looking at a lot of these production books, right? It's always sort of super fascinating to see the behind the scenes, how a lot of these things were sort of created. Again, I think always sort of looking at things as a creator is worthwhile, right? Not necessarily getting too caught up in the surface of the movie, but understanding how a lot of these things kind of are made, and how these decisions were created, I think is always sort of super interesting, right? It's so easy to get caught up in what sort of ended up there. But again, you have to understand that, someone decided to make this film much more like, the Geiger Alien and much less like the Alien you saw in the beginning. And I think it's interesting to look at how people are still pushing forward, what is acceptable in terms of style. I know that for a lot of people, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was like a major thing because it really pushed everyone away from this standard kind of animated look that everyone was just kind of addicted to and stuck in. And it really sort of made, everyone open to the possibility on a commercial sense. Because again, a lot of this is just a matter of like the people with money, like what they're willing to risk that money on. And I think, again, it's important for artists to kind of keep pushing that forward and to be, sort of thinking about that, because again, it does always sort of open up a lot of doors. But it's always been surprising to me the degree to which the animation industry is kind of really fixated on very sort of particular looks, given the freedom that you have to create anything, right? Again, if looking at a lot of those sort of avant-garde comics has taught you is, if you're just sort of dealing with essentially creating a two-dimensional image, like you can do anything, like anything is possible. You can create worlds and ideas and concepts and stories that are essentially infinite and yet we're often sort of locked into very static ideas about, what is okay. And these sort of Spider-Man films really sort of pushed that forward for a lot of people. And I know like inspired a lot of, sort of younger artists recently. I know a lot of people are really, really into this kind of art style and, what it has opened up. And going back to comics, finally, again, I think it's always interesting to see often the time it takes for different ideas to kind of filter through. If we look at often how we have kind of ended up quite recently with a really sort of interesting new format of graphic novel that's possible that is much more sort of focused on a younger audience. Right here we've got Amulet by Kazuo Kobushi, and this I think is book 2. And yeah, this is completely sort of new, I guess, in the last sort of decade or so, type of comic that has become sort of acceptable to do, right? Where you have someone creating for a younger audience, these kind of cool fantastical worlds where you can have like sort of different characters and weird storylines, and it's very sort of fun, I guess, to be a kid these days, because you have so many of these kind of different things to read, different worlds that just sort of weren't around, right? It was all sort of superheroes. So it's interesting how a lot of these things, come full circle. And if you sort of track a lot of that back, it was a big step for, I think, Kazuo Kobushi to create the sort of Flight anthology, which kind of led to and opened up a lot of the possibilities, I think, for a lot of artists to create comic books in styles that weren't about superheroes, right? And this is a great sort of anthology that I don't know whether it's still going. I don't know what the deal with it is, but it was a big thing, I remember, for really sort of pushing things forward in terms of like, you can create comics in English that aren't superheroes, right? Which was a massive sort of thing that was, not necessarily obvious to everyone at the time. And I think it gave a lot of people voice to kind of think about that and start to sort of at least build little stories and, sort of start to think about how that might work for them. But, I would imagine a lot of people were kind of inspired by, and a lot of that kind of younger audience thing, I think comes from, someone like sort of Jeff Smith really sort of putting down a vision for what that sort of might look like. And this was, if you kind of think about Jeff Smith's Bone, which I think is just an amazing sort of book that really kind of, it was just weird at the time. So again, it's always, you look back at these things and you're like, oh, obviously, right? That's kind of like a funny, weird sort of book for, not quite sure who it's for, right? Again, this is one of these things where you would sort of read Bone when it was kind of coming out, like as actual sort of comics, which I did sort of early on. And you can hear Jeff Smith sort of talk about how long it took to get traction with that book, because it is just this weird thing that was completely alien to the English-speaking market at that time, where it's kind of like, it's kind of for kids, but it's kind of for adults, and it's kind of funny, and it's kind of creepy, and it's just a very distinct point of view, right? It's kind of got these like cute characters, and they're funny, and it's got these bad guys that are kind of funny as well, but some of these drawings are actually really creepy. And it has this interesting mix of like Disney-esque kind of cartoony characters, but also this real sort of chiaroscuro, like black and white effect that is super interesting. And, and it gets a lot more like that, sort of later in the pages. Again, I think it ended up being like 1,300 pages long. Super interesting, amazing sort of book. But again, it's often this process where you have someone just kind of making something and trying to figure it out and sort of pushing things forward, like I think Jeff Smith did with Bone for English-speaking non-superhero graphic novels and comics, and pushing through and not necessarily giving up, right, when a lot of other people probably would have given up, right? It took a long time for this book to get traction, and then it get finished, and then I think now it sort of does pretty well. It's been repackaged, and it's kind of sits alongside, right, a lot of the books which, have sort of come out more recently that are, again, sort of in color. So yeah, it's often, you don't often see these kind of new things kind of come along and change the paradigm and really sort of morph and twist and give new artists good and interesting ideas until much later on. So anyway, there's not necessarily any point to a lot of this. It's just to kind of point out and talk through and think through some of the ways that often you can have artists like Jeff Smith. Again, I have no idea about what his actual lived experience of that was, but I understand it was very hard to kind of get this to happen, to exist. It needed to be self-published, and like Jean Giraud and co making Metal Hurlant, right? It probably wasn't necessarily the most financially successful thing at the time to go against all those conventional wisdoms of what is sort of normal and what sells, but in the end you get really interesting things, and that's what pushes the needle forward. Okay, so as I said, there's not a lot of like, oh, and this is the end to that story, because this is a cycle of constant renewal, right? This kind of keeps happening. And what I would say is the reason I kind of, again, try to sort of put that together and just sort of talk through some of these things is that often it's really good to look at the past where this has happened, because we're fully removed from it. We can really see what's happening, and it seems obvious, but it's never obvious now where we are, where those kind of boundaries are, and where you may need to sort of push forward. And also it's important to understand that the process of doing that is not necessarily this kind of fun and easy process. We always look back at these things and kind of go like, wow, that was amazing that these people had the guts to kind of push those ideas into the mainstream consciousness. But there probably was a lot of resistance at the time. They're often not that financially successful in the beginning. And I think it's important to sort of consider that. But I would say that I think the environment we're in today is very much sort of invaded by groupthink, and talking about, again, into the Spider-Verse, the way that you have just so many of these entertainment products, so many of these video games, so many of these things that just very sort of vague pastiches of each other, right? They're just very flimsy copies. And I think the way that AI art and AI replication has really just sort of proved and shown to people that, like, yeah, you can just mash together stuff that has previously existed and just create an infinity of kind of sludge, right? I think we're very much in one of those times where we haven't quite seen stuff sort of push past a lot of those boundaries and kind of figure out what's next for sort of what is possible. I think, again, that's like an interesting thing to consider, especially if you're kind of younger and really sort of thinking about where you want to go. But yeah, it's always good to consider, I think, how often, I think where this tends to work really well is where you do have a Jean Giraud who becomes a Moebius. You do have someone who has the craft, right, like someone like Ridley Scott, to be an excellent director, and then sort of really push a lot of that into creating something that, is a little bit new, even though, maybe they didn't really even have this massive intention to push things forward. But often it is a good combination of understanding what has come before you and understanding what needs to change about it, and having both the craft and the skill to kind of push that forward, and the sort of interest and the foresight and the vision, I guess. So it's often a mix of those things, and I think that's important to consider, because often it is very tricky if you just kind of jump out and sort of push forward. And I think, like a lot of artists that I've sort of shown, they encountered a lot of trouble, right? And it wasn't always sort of pretty to do that. So I think having a good foot and grounding in what is acceptable and the craft that you're going to need to kind of demonstrate a lot of those ideas is often where the magic happens. Anyway, let me know if that sort of makes sense, whether this has kind of helped you think through some of these issues at all. Hopefully some of these like stories and ideas and transitions were a little bit new, things you kind of hadn't heard of before. But yeah, other than that, let me know what you think in the comments down below. And yeah, happy drawing.